right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the October 3rd Thursday Web Forum for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS partnership. We host this webinar series on the third Thursday of every month right here at 10 a.m. Eastern Time as an opportunity for staff to share the latest updates on the blueprint, get input and involvement from folks like y'all, and highlight exciting science and action in the world of landscape conservation in our region. So here's our usual agenda for today. I'll start by introducing our speaker, who will present for 30 to 40 minutes or so on our monthly topic. We'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. I'll wrap up by previewing next month's webinar and sharing a few quick updates from your SECAS staff. As a heads up, you probably saw I am recording this webinar. It's just as an option for the one or two folks who inevitably email me later and say, hey, I had a conflict, can you share the recording? I will post that as well as the slides to the SECAS website within a day or two. Any questions or comments before we get started? All right, not hearing any. Let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. We're going to be hearing from Lance Garrison, who's a research fisheries biologist with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Southeast Fisheries Science Center. And he's going to be talking about some really exciting efforts to model marine mammal abundance in the Gulf of Mexico. These models are incorporated into the Southeast Conservation Blueprint as part of our Gulf Marine Mammals Indicator. And this project, as I expect you'll hear as Lance goes on today, it also encompasses models for sea turtles that are also part of the blueprint as part of our Gulf Sea Turtles Indicator, and seabirds, which we're hoping to incorporate as soon as that data becomes publicly available. And I'll be inviting those other researchers to present on other components of this GoMMAPPS work in future webinars, but today we'll be really focused on the marine mammal side of things. So with that, please go ahead and take it away.
Very good. Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining today. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off just to save interwebs and try to see if I can successfully share my screen. Okay, well, thank you again, everyone, for having us join today. I'm excited to talk to you about the GoMMAPPS project, the Gulf of Mexico Marine Assessment Program for Protected Species. This was a project funded jointly between NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, and BOEM to look at collecting data to support the development of habitat models that can then help to inform management efforts and spatial planning throughout the Gulf of Mexico. I just want to start out with the acknowledgments. Again, recognizing the funding partners. A good number of our partners are also managed through the Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Miami. And as with all of these large projects that involve a lot of data management, a lot of data analysis, we're really dependent upon the teams that go out in the field to collect really super high quality data. So just want to acknowledge the many, many people that contributed to this work and helped really make this project really successful. As we all know, the Gulf of Mexico is one of the most heavily industrialized bodies of water in the world. And in particular, there's a number of human activities that have significant impacts on marine mammal species across habitats from the estuaries all the way out into the deep ocean. There are very high level of fishing activities, particularly things like pelagic longline in the deep water, shrimp trawling up in the shelf water, reef fish fishing in certain portions of the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and each of these has an opportunity to interact with marine mammals or influence their prey. The Gulf is also home to some of the major shipping ports in the United States or in North America. And vessel traffic in particular, both because of the noise it generates, but also the risk of vessel strikes on large whales is a particular concern and cause direct mortality. We also have extensive oil and gas exploration in the western half of the Gulf of Mexico, particularly on the shelf and in the intermediate depth waters. And all of this industrial activity and the exploration associated with oil and gas creates a lot of noise, which is a particular challenge for marine mammals that really rely upon sound to allow them to communicate, to allow them to find prey, and to allow them exist effectively within this very heavily used human habitat. On top of that, of course, we had the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in April of 2010, which dumped about 134 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. That oil spread throughout habitats, again, in the from the estuaries all the way out into the deep ocean, and really overlapped with the habitat of nearly every marine mammal that occupies the Gulf, as well as, of course, seabirds and sea turtles. As part of the injury assessment, we evaluated the impacts of oil exposure to the bottlenose dolphins and offshore species, and most of the species had some degree of overlap and had population impacts that resulted in are predicted to result in short-term declines in population size, some long-term reproductive effects that slow the growth of the population. And so the projected models said they're sort of taking the decades to recover to come back up to the population level that they had before the spill. And as part of the natural resources damage assessment and the subsequent restoration projects, we're looking at better understanding the injury assessment now that we have additional data collected, as well as developing restoration projects that focus on evaluating and reducing anthropogenic impacts so we can help make up the losses that occurred during the spill. On top of that, now we have some new things coming into the Gulf, particularly aquaculture and wind energy development, and particularly, again, sort of focus of industrial activity. So we're layering this additional potential stressor on top, and really understanding both how that's going to impact marine mammals and turtles and seabirds, but also how it impacts how we conduct surveys. So if we have towers out there, then we're not going to be able to fly airplanes in those areas. So we're having to adapt both our science and our conservation and management to these new potential impacts. So within each of these, we have about 21 marine mammal stocks. It's a diverse group of tropical and subtropical species that occupy estuarine, continental shelf, and oceanic waters of the Gulf. There are two endangered large whales. The first is the Rice's whale, which is one of the more endangered species in the world. We think the population size is certainly less than 100. With the best population estimated at around 50 animals. And we're learning more and more over the last few years about their distribution and the degree to which they overlap with some of these activities. There's also the ESA-listed sperm whale, which has been the focus of studies over the last couple of decades, understanding how oil exploration, particularly in the deep water, impacts that species, in particular exposure to sound from seismic surveys that can cause disturbances and changes in feeding patterns. There's a suite of the dwarf and pygmy sperm whales, as well as the beaked whales, which are deep diving, more cryptic animals that occur in the deep portions of the ocean, as well as a broad suite of smaller cetaceans and the so-called blackfish, short-fin pilot whales, killer whales, pygmy killer whales, again, who are occupying sort of that mid-water or feeding in that mid-water range, diving to depths of 400 to 600 meters to feed, and really focusing in the deep ocean where their productivity or the availability of prey is driven by oceanographic features, as well as oceanic dolphins like the Clymene dolphin pictured here, and pantropical spotted dolphins, which are broadly distributed and very abundant and interact with all of these things. So again, we have this very diverse fleet of animals that occupy diverse habitats. They overlap with different spatially and temporally to differing degrees with different human activities. And so understanding how those activities influence these species really requires a good understanding of their habitat requirements, their spatial distribution, and how those things vary across time and space. So to address these questions and provide information for managers to help assist in spatial planning and management of all of these impacts, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, NOAA, and its partner agencies funded the GoMMAPPS project, which was a multi-agency, multi-species study that ran from 2017 to 2022. The goal was to provide information on abundance, distribution, habitat use, and behavior of cetaceans, seabirds, and sea turtles in the Gulf of Mexico. And our focus at NOAA was on the marine mammal spatial density, as well as the sea turtle spatial density models that are derived from aerial and vessel information to generate temporally specific maps, monthly maps of animal distribution and evaluation of some long-term trends in abundance over time. So the first data collection tool we used were aerial surveys. We conducted 3 seasonal line transect surveys during 2017 and 2018, and the track lines are depicted on the map in the right-hand corner. These are oriented perpendicular to the shoreline and are spaced at about 20-kilometer intervals covering the entire Gulf of Mexico in U.S. waters over the continental shelf, with some higher density lines in some of the key estuaries in Mississippi Sound and Barataria Bay. These surveys were designed for analysis using distance analysis line transect approaches, which explicitly try to estimate detection probability by employing two survey teams in the aircraft during the survey, so that we can come up with absolute estimates of abundance and account for known sources of bias and abundance estimates. The survey focuses on marine mammals and sea turtles, but also collected some data on manta rays in particular, some other larger species that are visible from the aircraft. And these data have also been used to inform manta ray models and potentially a couple of other species that we collect along the way. So this just shows kind of what the sightings look like and what the species distribution looks like. Note that in the winter of 2018, we had an incomplete survey primarily due to weather issues. And this is kind of a theme with all of us trying to figure out how we can effectively collect poor weather conditions in the winter months, and winter and cold water periods continue to be a significant challenge in substantial seasonal changes, for example, with movements of animals from the east coast of Florida with lower densities found in the fall compared to changes in the spatial distribution of animals throughout the seasons. Likewise, we collect sea turtle data on these surveys as well, focusing primarily, most of our sightings are Kemp's Ridley turtles, loggerhead turtles, and leatherback turtles. We do see occasional green turtles. One of the challenges for sea turtles is that there are a large number of unidentified hard. We do our abundance estimates and partition the unidentified sightings based on habitat features. The turtles that we see in these surveys are likely the larger juveniles and adults, and we do not feel like we can see turtles that are smaller than 30 centimeters. So we're really only representing a portion of the entire sea turtle population. And we see these higher densities particularly for some species like Kemp's Ridley in particular seasons and regions. We have higher densities out on the continental shelf in the deeper waters of the continental shelf in the Western Gulf, and high densities of loggerhead turtles in the Eastern Gulf as well. For most of the oceanic marine mammal stocks and the species that occur off of the continental shelf break, we rely on large vessel surveys. So these are surveys conducted aboard NOAA vessels, and they go out for surveys that are 60 days in length. We have about three 20-day duration legs. And we conducted, again, 3 seasonal line transect surveys between 2017 and 2018, 2 in the summer and 1 in the winter, again, keeping in mind that the winter is always a bit challenging. Likewise, we estimated detection probability using 2 survey teams. And the benefit of having the large vessel is we're also able to collect a lot of environmental data and passive acoustic data along the way. That included continuous surface sampling of all environmental conditions like sea surface temperature, salinity, fluorescence, and others. We had collected vertical profiles with both CTDs and XBTs to get at some of the vertical habitat features, and conduct information on acoustic backscatter, which is an indicator of prey availability. We also towed a passive acoustic array behind these vessels, and this listens for the sounds that marine mammal make. They can provide us an alternative detection capability, particularly for things like beaked whales and sperm whales that spend a lot of time underwater. The passive acoustic array really provides an additional opportunity to collect those data and correct for the availability of animals at the surface when they're not available to visual surveys. All of these surveys also included dedicated seabird observers, which were run by Fish and Wildlife Service, and so we have those data collected off of these surveys as well. In a total, we conducted about 20,000 kilometers of visual survey. We had 709 marine mammal sightings, including 19 identified species, about 1,400 hours of acoustic effort. And then in addition to these surveys conducted in 2017 and 18, we have surveys with a similar design, similar methodologies from 2003, 2004, and 2009. And collectively, these data allowed us to generate models that represent animal distribution over longer time frames and evaluate trends. So, as I mentioned, during winter months, we had relatively poor sighting conditions and an incomplete survey, I think, in that year because there was a government shutdown in that month. We had high encounter rates in the Western Gulf of Mexico on our surveys, which was actually is different from what we had seen in the past. Generally speaking, we have much higher detection probabilities in the Northeastern Gulf in our historical surveys, but throughout the Western Gulf, relatively low densities of animals in 2017 and 2018. We had relatively high densities. And so again, it just gets to the fact that we see a lot of this environmental variability across time, and we want to understand how that influences the distribution and abundance of marine mammals and therefore their exposures to anthropogenic. So the products from GoMMAPPS is the big overview. We updated the abundance estimates for 26 cetacean stocks and 4 sea turtle species. We estimated sperm whale abundance from passive acoustic data in addition to the visual survey data. We developed spatial density models for 15 cetacean species and stocks and 4 sea turtle species, and developed new models that address uncertainty in abundance estimates. So we accounted for things like availability at the surface. We accounted for things like probability of detection. So we've incorporated more sources of uncertainty and better corrections for some of the bias in our abundance estimates as well. And we're able to assess some interannual changes in both distribution and abundance over time. So really just a wealth of data to update all the information used to assess and understand the species, the populations of marine mammals and sea turtles in the Gulf from this project. We analyze these data and develop habitat maps using a 2-stage spatial density modeling approach. This starts with the aerial survey or the segments and sightings, as well as dynamic predictor variables derived from satellite data, as well as hydrographic models, as well as bathymetric features and other parameters that go into describing the habitat. The first stage is the estimation of detection probability, which allows us to translate detections on the track line into estimates of actual animal density. So we account for things like the probability that animals are going to be at the surface, the likelihood of detecting them as a function of distance from the track line, and the influence of environmental conditions on those probabilities. We then plug those into generalized additive models that help us quantify species-environment relationships. So we look at some of these more complex relationships between density and the distribution of environmental variables, and then take that resulting model and project those out spatially using dynamic predictor variables like chlorophyll, sea surface temperature, metrics of surface features like eddy circulation patterns and sea surface height. And the end result is a prediction of animal density over space and time. And these are resolved as mean predictions from 2015 to 2019 at monthly timescales. And so those are the final products, as well as products for overall abundance and metrics of uncertainty. So we'll go to the next slide. So one of the big outcomes from these are the abundance estimates that we get for all of our species, and these go directly into the Marine Mammal Protection Act required stock assessment reports. And given that now we have a couple more years of data, as well as our historical data, we're able to assess some trends over time. The first of these, for some species, like for example, sperm whales, we don't see very strong trends over time, so we don't think there's anything major going on in terms of the overall abundance. But for suites of species, particularly for the oceanic dolphins, we saw some fairly good evidence of significant trends over time, where sort of in the early part of the time series, our abundance estimates for pantropical spotted dolphins were on the order of 70 to 80,000 animals. And during 2017 and 18, our abundance estimates are more averaging on the order of between 30 and 50,000 animals. And similarly for spinner dolphins and Clymene dolphins, we had much fewer sightings than we had on prior surveys. For some of the blackfish, the deeper diving, large cetaceans, larger whales, we also had some declines, though the uncertainty bounds, which are what are shown in the parentheses here, are quite large for those species because they're rare, relatively rare. So it's difficult to assess trend over time in those, but we do have some indication of trends. And then just the two rows at the bottom are highlighting the deep diving cryptic species, the beaked whales and the kogia, for which there's a lot of variability, both primarily because we do have issues with whether or not they're actually visible to the survey, and their detections can be significantly affected by weather conditions. So again, we have these indications, and we can show those graphically, of sort of these larger scale trends in population size for oceanic dolphins, and particularly for pantropical spotted dolphins. These are statistically significant, as well as indications for some of the rarer whales that we're detecting some declines over time between 2009 and the more recent survey estimates. And there's some additional passive acoustic data that's been collected recently, as well as information about the underlying productivity of the Gulf and changes in the mesopelagic fish community that support this idea that at least during this time frame, there were some changes in productivity that we might be seeing reflected here in these population estimates. When we project some of these things out, and again, within these models, we were able to statistically test whether or not some of those differences between the early and the later part of the time series were significant. But it's also just important to note that within this suite of oceanic dolphins, we have differences in habitat use. During the more recent surveys, we had lower overall abundance estimates for all species or densities for all species that were associated with dominance of more positive, more high sea surface height values throughout the Gulf of Mexico. And then we also see these habitat differences between the species, with pantropical spotted dolphins and spinner dolphins being more concentrated in the eastern Gulf, and Clymene dolphins being more concentrated in the western Gulf. So again, showing how these animals tend to partition habitat across space. For sperm whales, rather than seeing a substantial population decline, what we actually observed were population shifts. Sperm whales, generally, we have observed along the continental shelf break and in areas of relatively high density in the northeastern Gulf, as well as in the southeastern Gulf. There are groups of sperm whales in the past. But in the more recent surveys, we had much lower densities in the northeastern and southeastern Gulf, and much higher densities, particularly over in the western Gulf and in the deeper water as well. And so when we start looking at the differences in habitat features, we can sort of explain how those changes are coming about. The top slide here is sea surface height anomaly and the indicator of the presence of loop current eddies in the northeastern Gulf in particular. And you can see that in 2003, the sperm whales were sort of rubbed up against the continental shelf break and are associated with areas on the outer edges of the loop current ring and areas of relatively negative sea surface height where there's relatively higher productivity water. Whereas in 2017 and 18, the whole Gulf of Mexico was dominated more by high sea surface height anomaly waters. The loop current was further south. The loop current eddy was further south, and the animals were therefore spread more widely across the habitat. And this is again reflected in a shift in our density models, where our prediction for the summer of 2003 captured this high density up in the northeastern part of the Gulf, and the summer 2018 model captured higher density in deeper waters, and particularly out further west. And so one of the questions we want to ask with this, and what we're really interested in is understanding, is whether or not this reflects a longer-term trend in how the Gulf of Mexico is being structured, or is it just representing this interannual variability in the location of the loop current, which then drives interannual variability in the distribution of productivity throughout the Gulf of Mexico. We just when we look across all of these models, we highlight the importance of understanding the mesoscale eddy structure. Moving on to the next slide. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to say it. Moving on, the mesoscale eddy structure, and particularly sea level anomaly and geostrophic velocity, which are indicators of where those eddies are occurring, as really important in terms of driving the distribution of these animals, because it's around the edges of those eddies that productivity gets concentrated. Many of the species have relationships with sea surface temperature, which may actually really reflect seasonal differences in their occurrence in different parts of the habitat. And then pointing out for the Clymene spinner, for the oceanic dolphins, we have this era effect or a time effect, which again supports this sort of observed decrease in overall density for these species through time. Next slide. So the other species of focus is the Rice's whales. I mentioned earlier, this is one of the most endangered species in the world, and it was really important to understand their habitat and spatial distribution. In the past, they have been observed primarily in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, mostly because that's where most of our survey effort has come up. And we expanded on the data collected during GoMMAPPS, as well as a number of other surveys collected between 2013 and 2019 to develop a similar habitat model, and highlighted two really important features in predicting the distribution of these animals. The first are cooler bottom water temperatures, especially in the outer edges of the continental shelf around water depths of 200 meters. So that's an indicator that some of the deeper, higher productivity water is being pushed up into the shallower part of the habitat. So right along this shelf edge and shelf break, they're relying on the input of higher. The habitat is characterized by the input of higher nutrient water near the bottom. as well as inflows of chlorophyll, especially from riverine features and Gulf and Mississippi River outflow that then gets transported into the northern part of the habitat. And the combination of these complex dynamic features around the shelf break, as well as the input of high productivity, supports high concentrations of fish species along that shelf break area, and are seen to be really important for supporting Rice's whales in these habitats. So we predicted from this model that there's suitable Rice's whale habitat throughout these similar waters in the Gulf of in the northern Gulf, and even into the southern Gulf, where we haven't collected a lot of survey data, or hadn't collected a lot of survey data. As we go through time, we've collected some aerial survey data and passive acoustic data in the western Gulf, and seen that Rice's whales are occurring there where they hadn't been observed very often in the past, as well as passive acoustic data again within this shelf break region, and most recently the detections of animals in that shelf break area in Mexican waters as well. So as we're predicting where suitable habitat is, then we're going out and collecting survey and passive acoustic data to confirm whether Rice's whales are actually using those habitats or not, and learning quite a lot about how they're using the environment in the Gulf. Next slide. So especially important for wind energy development are the predictions of animal densities up on the continental shelf break. Primarily the two marine mammal species are bottlenose dolphins and Atlantic spotted dolphins, which again segregate the habitat, with Atlantic spotted dolphins occurring in deeper waters on the outer part of the continental shelf. And there are various populations of bottlenose dolphins in shelf waters that likely have some seasonal movements and are predicted by our models. And next slide. And then we're also collecting data and predicting the abundance and spatial distribution of sea turtles, again, keeping in mind that these are the larger sea turtles, not the really small ones that also occur generally further offshore. For the particular challenge for sea turtles from aerial surveys is, of course, they spend most of their time underwater. So these surveys estimates actually relied on the availability of tag data collected by USGS and other partners to provide corrections for the probability that animals were going to be on the surface, so that we could generate unbiased abundance estimates. And again, we see some spatial differences in how loggerhead turtles, Kemp's Ridley turtles, and leatherback turtles are using these habitats over time. Next slide. So our data products are all now available on the NCEI data portal, and there's a QR code there to link to our data archive. This includes all of the visual sighting data from the aerial and vessel surveys, maps of density predictions for 15 cetacean species and 4 sea turtles. These are the monthly averaged oceanographic conditions during 2015 to 2019. The seabird data has been provided to our partners at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I think the sightings data are posted at NCI, as well as environmental data and some of the photographs as well. So that portal is really kind of the go-to data source for standardized and archived data sets from this and products from this study. Next slide. The density maps, in addition to being on the NCI archive, have also been distributed as 5-kilometer rasters on the cetacean density mapping tool available from the CMAP website at Duke. This also includes the sea turtle density surfaces. It does say the sea turtle and turtle density mapper now. And so this includes both density predictions at monthly scales for all of these species, as well as extrapolated density into the southern Gulf of Mexico based on predictions from our habitat models. And that was particularly important for the U.S. Navy, which is one of the partners that uses these data as well. So all of these data are available. Data and analytical products are available and readily downloadable for use by researchers and interested managers in particular. So next slide. So as we mentioned, one of the primary goals of this study is to provide tools to support spatial planning, and these models were directly integrated into a spatial planning exercise evaluating for offshore wind energy development, and this is in a paper led by Nick Farmer, as well as a group of us, in which they took the outputs from these density models and used them to develop indices of habitat suitability or habitat preferential habitat use for all of these species, and then combine those into a combined data layer that provides insight to areas where there might be higher or lower interactions with protected species groups. There's a weighting system for defining whether or not an area should be considered a high risk or a low risk area, and that really directly goes into some of the planning processes and some of the spatial portals that are used to support landscape or spatial planning, especially for offshore wind energy and aquaculture as well. So it really demonstrates kind of the practical pipeline between the data, the analytical products, and then being used in these tools to help support management efforts. Next slide. So yeah, as I mentioned, so these products are available and are supporting a diverse group of marine users and managers. They support regulatory needs of federal agencies, including the Department of Defense, Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, National Ocean Service, and others that are involved in spatial planning. We've already provided the products that are supporting aquaculture and wind energy development and other blue economy sectors in the Gulf. And then one of the things is just pointing out these interannual trends we're observing, as well as trends in spatial distribution, is that the continued and ongoing survey efforts are really important to continue to monitor the populations of these stocks. We do have this question of whether these are transient changes that might be caused by changes in distribution. The underlying oceanography of the Gulf of Mexico is also changing over time. And so we really need to understand how those changes are going to impact both the marine mammals in terms of their population dynamics as well as their spatial distribution. So fortunately, we just completed a couple of vessel surveys in summer of 2023 and 2024 that were funded through Deepwater Horizon, Open Ocean TIG monitoring and adaptive management funds to kind of update our understanding of the status of the populations as we start to develop restoration projects. So those surveys were just completed this year, and we'll be working over the next 6 to 8 months or so to update the density models and abundance estimates. And we're anticipating a couple of additional aerial surveys funded by Bureau of Offshore Energy Management over the continental shelf during 2025 and 2026. So while it would be nice to have surveys at a more regular frequency, at least I think we'll be spaced out about 5 years between surveys at this point. And hopefully we'll be able to continue that kind of frequency in the future so we can monitor trends and changes in population sizes over time. So with that, I appreciate your interest in this work and really excited to see what's coming next. And thanks for bearing with the slight technical issues. So,
thank you so much. That was fantastic, Lance. And yeah, I appreciate your flexibility with the tech issues, everyone. I particularly am impressed that this is something that y'all intend to keep up to date and continue to update these models as you get new survey data. That's exciting and something where we'll try to keep pulling the latest and greatest into the blueprint as it evolves as well. We do have plenty of time for questions, maybe 10 minutes or so. So if anyone does have a question or maybe wants to go back to some of the slides where I wasn't doing as good a job of keeping up, just holler. It's not a huge group today, so just feel free to pop yourself off of mute if you want, or you can put questions in the chat and I'll read those out for the benefit of the recording. Go ahead, Donna. Maybe on mute, Donna. Let me see if I can unmute you. It's not giving me the option to unmute your line, Donna. I'm not sure why. Maybe you wouldn't mind popping your question in the chat. I'm sorry, we seem to.
How about this? Can you?
Oh, there you are. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Yes, I was on mute. Great presentation, Lance. It's wonderful to see the data come together after early discussions for Deepwater Horizon and so how far you've come with the analysis and modeling. Congratulations. Temps Ridley, as you know, has not returned to that exponential trajectory of population increase. You talked about changes in habitat. Do you have any hypotheses about changes in habitat that might be influential in that suppression of the increase that was predicted?
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and thanks for the good comments. Yeah, we're super excited about these data and products coming online and having kind of that, as Hillary mentioned, that pipeline so that we can sort of keep updating these models. So I'm not the turtle biologist, and I think I would say that the last data that I have about abundance estimates and habitats are this 2017, 2018 data, and we saw a lot of Kemp's Ridley turtles off of the Florida East Coast in winter months, which had been consistent with what we had seen in past surveys. So yeah, I think it'll be really interesting if we can get those surveys in 25 and 26 and see if they kind of point to why we might have seen differences. I guess the other interesting thing, again, not being the turtle biologist, is everything's lagged. You're seeing I think you're assuming you're talking about kind of nesting beach counts of individuals, which means we're seeing what happened to them 20 years ago is what determines the numbers of animals that end up on the beach. So these big aggregations of animals that occur in the Eastern Gulf have been really interesting to me from surveys that we've conducted over time, and especially during deep water as well. So it'll be interesting to see if those are still there in this next round of surveys. So yeah, I'm sorry I don't have better insight on that, but it's not my thing.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'll be waiting with bated breath, so to speak, for the results from those surveys. And I will be waiting for more time to elapse to see those turtles mature and come into the nesting population. And this would point to the importance of our continued monitoring on the nesting beach.
True. Yeah,
Correct?
and that's the interesting bit with in water surveys for turtles, nesting beach surveys for turtles, and then whatever we do with understanding where all the little guys are is just the complexity in terms of looking at how those populations are trending across time really requires this multi-platform, multi-system mechanism to look at them. But I try to hopefully highlight well enough in these that we're focused on a particular life history stage, a particular group of animals that are using this continental shelf habitat. It's just part of the rest of the population.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that your agency and your partners are still supportive. My word of caution when I get the opportunity is that things do change with agencies over time, and support that was so steadfast for monitoring nesting is not so steadfast now, which it could lead to really significant data loss, data gaps. So just tooting the horn of long-term data collection being vital for our understanding of the populations of these animals. Thanks, you, Lance.
Agreed. Thank you.
Great question, Donna. And it may be that we could dig more into that too when we have one of these web forums more specifically focused on the sea turtle modeling as well. So stay tuned for that. I hope to have those folks on in next year's web forum series. Next hand I see is Michelle.
Hi, thank you. I want to echo Donna's gratitude for this excellent work. Lance, to you and your colleagues, this is really fascinating and appreciated. I have two questions. I'll ask them both and I'll let you decide which order you want to answer them. And my first one was, they're both about kind of the project footprint and survey designs. And so what was the boundary decision in terms of proximity to shore, near shore waters? It looked like it wasn't consistent distance from shore around the Gulf. I might have been mistaken, but that was question number one. And then question number two is, given how much more industry, particularly energy infrastructure, there is on the Texas-Louisiana shelf versus the Florida shelf, I'm just wondering if there is any indication that industry either interferes with or influences the surveys.
So I'll start with the first one. So the aerial surveys basically cover the continental shelf. So we're covering essentially from the shoreline to, roughly speaking, the 200-meter isobath or the shelf break from the aircraft surveys. And that's essentially just because of distance, right? Especially on the West Florida shelf, by the time you fly to the West Florida shelf break, you need to come back before that's about the time you have. And then the large vessel surveys cover from the shelf break, so they actually go up to the 100-meter isobath out to the US EEZ. And so those are kind of the boundary lines. So that shelf break region, they're right along the shelf break between the 100 to 300 meter isobaths, that very narrow, spatially narrow range is one that kind of becomes a seam between the two surveys. We're conducting some additional surveys this year. We hope to cover that area a little better. And then we want to think in this next iteration of our models about how to kind of knit that boundary together a little bit better than we perhaps did with our last models. So that's kind of the boundary issues, and we are sort of limited to U.S. waters, so that's why we don't go, all the way south into Mexican waters, and that's also not only because it's U.S. funds and U.S. ships, but also because just from a practical point of view, even with 60 days of large vessel survey effort covering 7,500 kilometers of track line, it's a huge area to cover with a slow moving vessel. So, we have to be judicious in that. So with the really huge spatial difference between the level of industrialization in the eastern and western Gulf of Mexico is obviously really interesting, and it would be really great if we had data from the 40s and 50s to understand what things were like in that part of the Gulf of Mexico before industrialization. We do see it's really interesting, and I almost hesitate to even say it, but it's a fact that the one places in the Gulf where Rice's whales are common and still, it's a good and highly productive habitat. It is also the quietest place in the Gulf where there isn't any oil and gas development. And so I think there are some things like that of, sort of these overall patterns, the overall level of interactions, and this big spatial difference in the use of the Gulf that I think are really interesting, especially as we maybe start to build some models that can look at, because we do have data back in the 80s and 90s, and it would be nice to start building models that look at those sort of decadal scale trends, and then hopefully those would then feed climate models that would look at forward-looking decadal scale trends. So that's something we're really interested in too, is trying to get at these decadal issues, which are beyond the scope of the models they're working on now. As far as interference in survey design, so far, no, we're able to work around platforms and oil platforms and things like that with our surveys so far. That will change if they start building wind turbines out there, since I think we currently fly at 600 feet in our aircraft surveys, and the top of the wind turbine plus propeller is like 1,600 feet. So clearly we're not going to be able to survey the way we surveyed in the past, particularly in those sort of nearer coastal waters. So we're looking at ways to integrate cameras and other systems into the aircraft. We're looking at that anyway, because we want to hopefully reduce the number of people in the planes, and then have a more replicated data set to mine after the survey. But that also would then allow us to fly at higher altitudes. And so that's something we're really focused on in kind of our development of technologies to adapt to the changes we'll have to make once these things are in place, assuming they continue to go forward. So.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Lance.
Yeah, great questions, Michelle. That was really interesting. Megan, you have been very patient. Your turn.
Thanks. Thanks for such a great presentation. I had a question kind of about your use of some of the acoustic data you collect. You mentioned that there's a towed hydrophone array and that you were using some passive acoustics for the Rice's whale. Do you include that data in the models, and then could you use that for other species such as beaked whales?
So not as of yet, not for these models. We have an alternative. We did do with the passive towed array data that we collected from this survey. We also generated separate abundance estimates, or acoustically derived abundance estimates for sperm whales, which are interesting in that they compare fairly well with the visual estimates, especially in some of the summer surveys. But we haven't done that. We haven't directly integrated the acoustic data into the spatial density models or the overall abundance estimates that we actually publish in the stock assessment reports. That is actually a huge area of research right now. There is a large-scale passive acoustic monitoring study called Listen GoMMAPPS that is funded through NOAA's Restore Science program that another researcher at our lab, Melissa Soldevilla, leads up. And that study has a network of moored passive acoustic units. So these are hydrophones that sit on the bottom of the seafloor in a stationary position and can monitor continuously over the course of 10 months. And if you leave them out, over the course of 5 years. They're in the 5th year of that project with another 5 years that they just got renewed, or we anticipate getting renewed, that should go a bit longer. So we're really interested in looking, and we are working within the scope of that project on how we can directly integrate passive acoustic data and visual data into these habitat models. And that's specifically looking for things like beaked whales and kogia. And because the passive acoustic data are collecting time series, they have a much better temporal resolution, but the visual surveys provide this synoptic, one-shot space, overall broad scale spatial image. So sort of combining the information across those two platforms really has the potential to provide some really valuable information on trends, changes in time, and sort of the integration across different spatial and temporal scales. How to actually do that appropriately statistically, given the differences in the model types and the complexity of the underlying oceanographic features, is tricky. And we're sort of actively, we have a couple of researchers within that project who are actively working on that right now. So I would say over the next few years, we should start to see models coming out that are integrating both the passive acoustic and the visual survey data.
Thank you.
Another great question. I might just pause once more and see if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and move on with wrapping us up. But this has been fantastic discussion. Okay, so I'll go ahead and jump back in and wrap us up. But if something does occur to you in the next few minutes, we'll pause again for questions at the very end. So I wanted to quickly preview next month's web forum. We're going to be hearing from SECAS Science Coordinator Ruel Mordecai about what's new in the latest version of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint and a preview of what's coming in the next update to the SECAS Goal Report. So this version of the blueprint, which just came out last week, does improve some of the data and the prioritization in the continental Southeast, particularly some indicator updates in the terrestrial and the marine environments. We've added a new indicator, an improved indicator looking at grasslands and savannas. And likewise with the goal report, that's going to be scheduled for release in January. And that's also got some updated data and methods for our bird indicators and a new indicator of grassland and savanna areas. So if you follow the blueprint or the goal report or other SECAS products, definitely encourage you to tune into that and learn about all the changes and improvements we've made. So that really ties into the updates I wanted to share from the SECAS staff team. As I said, the blueprint version 2024 is now available. It was released last week. And so that latest and greatest data is now available in our Blueprint Explorer online viewer, our SECAS Atlas, which is in ArcGIS Online and makes all the map services available, and then our direct data download for those who want to use the data in their desktop GIS. I did want to highlight that the Blueprint Explorer has a new web address, and obviously the links from the SECAS website have been updated to reflect that new address, but if you're someone who uses the Blueprint Explorer a lot and has that bookmarked, I just encourage you to please update that. There is a redirect going from the original URL to the new one, but that won't be up indefinitely. So I encourage you to update your bookmarks to the new URL if that's something that you do. And then moving from the release of this blueprint, we are going straight into our workshop series to review the data and get your feedback on what we're missing, what we're doing well. This was sort of based on feedback from past workshops where folks said, hey, It would really help me to have the underlying indicator data, the corridors, the documentation to inform my feedback on how we can improve the blueprint. And so based on that, we've moved workshops to after the release of the final blueprint. The first workshop is actually next Tuesday. So if you haven't already registered, it's not too late. There are 13 workshops. They're virtual, hosted via Zoom. Each one lasts an hour and a half. And there are at least 2 chances to review any area within the SECAS geography that you might be interested in. I might ask if there's another member of the SECAS staff team who could drop the link to the workshop page in the chat. That has all the links to register. And there's a great workshop that might be a good fit for people who are interested in today's webinar that's focused on Gulf states and the Gulf marine environment. And I'm going to put the registration link for that webinar in the chat. That one is going to be October 28th at 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Central. So a great opportunity to review the blueprint and see how this great marine mammal data that we just learned about is coming through in the priorities in the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's really all I had. I always like to end on this slide. If you would like to get more involved in SECAS, I do encourage you to join the SECAS newsletter. You can do that on the footer of any page of our website, secassoutheast.org. That'll get you a monthly newsletter and a reminder email about this web forum so that you never miss a topic that you're interested in. We obviously encourage you to reach out to your SECAS staff for help, especially if you're interested in using the blueprint. We would love to hear how this latest version of the blueprint is working for you, and particularly would love to see you at a workshop if you'd like to come and really dig into those priorities. So with that, I'm going to pause again for questions and just see if anything else has occurred to folks before we hang up today. All right, not hearing any. So thank you again, Lance, so much for your great presentation. Really appreciate you all being here and participating in the discussion and asking such great questions. I hope that we will see you in November for Rua's presentation on the new blueprint and goal report. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate your interest in the work. So.